Hello and welcome to Don Catchment Rivers Trust's audio series on the River Don, which brings together people's memories and stories from their lives in connection to the river in Doncaster and the surrounding area. Throughout each episode, we explore a different theme, and in this episode, the theme is A Landscape in Recovery. We've woven together 8 different interviews, which were each recorded separately, in which people talk about how much the river has recovered from past conditions and what their hopes and concerns for the future of the river are.
So, came up to Doncaster, where I joined a team of people working on the natural sciences. My life completely changed, all about the local geology, botany, etc., and the history of these various ologies and the people of the past who had worked on these subjects in the Doncaster district. Many of these notable people from the past had been members of the Doncaster Naturalist Society, which I very rapidly joined, and the Yorkshire Naturalist Union. As soon as I joined the staff at the Doncaster Museum, I joined these 2 organisations. I was immediately surrounded by people who were extremely knowledgeable and very happy to share their knowledge. By far, in my personal view, the most influential of these characters, and now I come to mention his name, I can't remember, Chris Firth. His father before him knew about the fish in the River Don and knew about local angling absolutely inside out. And Chris had all sorts of wonderful original ideas as to how to try to get the river functioning as a natural river again, rather than an industrial trench, as it were.
My name's Christopher John Firth. I was born in Doncaster and only a few hundred yards away from the River Don in 1944. I've worked on the River Don for the last 40 years. Fortunately, things that have happened in my life brought me back to the river and gave me the opportunity to begin a process alongside many other colleagues to repair the river. I've been very fortunate in that respect because it's been a labour of love. In 1982, I was in discussions with a colleague and he said, "Do you realise that there is an opportunity to apply for a job as a fisheries officer in Doncaster?" Everybody laughed at it because everybody knew that the River Don was a dead entity. There was nothing there. It was completely dead, and the opportunity was one which, to say the least, was challenging. I remember particularly electrofishing. It was a way that we carried out surveys to see whether there were fish there, and if so, what. I remember, with the exception of some of the little streams right at the top of the River Don, and we were probably doing 30, 40 sites every year, we never caught a single fish. It was totally dead. But one day we were electrofishing at Staveley on the River Rother, and a stickleback out to the surface. The elation is hard to explain. The fact that something had improved to the extent that something could live in that river. And I thought, then perhaps there is a future. Slowly from that point on, things began to improve. It was a slow process, really, through the 80s.
Everything was lined with industry. It's not that many years since that's changed. It's like things are getting better. Getting a bit political, but in decline in industry has equaled environmental improvement, hasn't
Definitely.
it?
So obviously with quite a steel industry, it helped the river though. It didn't help the area, but
The demise of many of the big heavy industries, steel and so on, chemicals, coal, these were the organisations which have contributed significantly chemically to the pollution of the river system. And within 4 years, we were carrying out experimental restocking with fish, and it progressively got better and better. Before the end of the 90s, we'd stocked over 1 million fish into the River Don. The fish farm that was established in Nottingham began to produce significant numbers of species which are subjected to flowing conditions. That had a major impact. That was a real turning point. Generally speaking, they adapted and began to establish a sustainable fish population. It wasn't just a question of sticking anything in the river. It was done on the basis of previous record, in line with chemical improvement of the river.
the lady at the farm, I've known her years since I was a young lad, and she stopped one day and she says, "Do you catch out in here yet?" And I says, "Well, yeah." As I was leaving, I pulled the net out and I showed her, and she says, "I would never have believed it if I hadn't seen it." And this is someone who, her cottage is on the Don banks. She says, "I thought you'd gone mad, to be fair." She says, "We just know there were nothing in it."
When I got a phone call from the emergency control in Leeds, to say that this chap had reported seeing a salmon in the river at Doncaster. And I was just, no, that can't be right. But we walked down and we eventually found this fish, and it was an 11-pound salmon. This fish had actually spawned, but clearly conditions at Doncaster were not suitable for a salmon to spawn. They need to get right up into the headwaters of the river. That highlighted an issue. And that issue was a fish's ability to be able to reach those traditional spawning sites. And the reason it was at Doncaster was because there was a 4-metre high sluice on the river, which created a complete barrier to movement beyond that point. I recognised that numerous other structures throughout the river created exactly the same conditions, whereby fish simply couldn't get any further. But there was also an issue of sustainability, because if they were subjected to high flows during a flood, many of them would get swept down. It's a perfectly normal phenomenon. But in a natural river without any obstructions, as the conditions improve, many of those fish would begin to migrate back upstream and repopulate. But of course, when you have a weir blocking their passage, they can't do that. One really big pollution could literally wipe the whole population out. The Environment Agency offered me the opportunity to research the history of the river, and what I found was quite staggering, really. It was a process which began way back in the 1600s and progressively damaged physically, as opposed to chemically, physically damaged the river. I mean, 70% plus of the River Don has been changed.
If I can remember my school days, there's a lot about when I think it was from Holland, changed all the river Bermudan.
That's what fascinates me, because you think of the river as a natural thing, but in this part of Doncaster, it's not remotely natural, and it probably won't be again because of all these sluices, and it only takes one thing not to work, and the whole thing just doesn't work.
I think the River Don used to go through Luddington or somewhere.
Yes.
Is that the River Don, or is that the same? Is that Old English for the River Don?
Yeah, that's the whole
Is that the
drainage scheme, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, we should be part of the drain catch.
And that's something that was my old fella in the car. As you're going through the road, dips a little, and he said, "Oh, that's the old river."
It's all started with land drainage, then moved on to navigation, altering the river, changing it, straightening the river, building locks and so on. We began to recognise the real importance of removing weirs or removing structures. That had a devastating effect. Salmon population fell apart because they simply couldn't get to the areas they needed to get to reproduce. And by late 17th century, 1790s, salmon populations had disappeared. Bear in mind, this was something like half century before the river became chemically damaged. So the research that I carried out gave us a pattern for improvement, to open up free passage for fish to reach the areas that they needed to reach to reproduce effectively. The Rivers Trust was formed in 2004 to have salmon back in Sheffield by 2020, and we managed to achieve that objective. We're responsible for building fish passes on weirs all the way through from Doncaster right through to the north of Sheffield.
Any fish can go from tidal reaches down here right into Sheffield unhindered, which is a good thing. There's a lot of time and effort gone in by a lot of people to put river right.
Where we as a trust couldn't do it, or we're always on hand to provide the information, the advice, technical knowledge, and we're now in a position where we've reached Bridge in terms of removing obstructions to fish passage. I suppose looking back at it, it's the most rewarding thing that's ever happened to me, to think that we'd beaten all the sceptics and we'd managed to achieve that objective.
The design of the River Dearne was largely determined by the requirements of the coal industry. So you got a river system there that was actually quite expensive to maintain. He came up with the idea of letting this dead straight river course meander. Let's put meanders back in. And it worked like a charm. They became self-sustaining.
There was a particular section of the River Dearne which had been heavily canalised under instruction and funding from the National Coal Board. Denby Ing's site was caused by the natural River Dearne channel being subject to very significant mining subsidence, and it just allowed the river to swamp a whole area of farmland. And the Coal Board failed to understand how rivers operate. The Coal Board insisted that the channel should be 1/3 wider than it naturally was and as straight as it possibly could be. Total nonsense.
I mean, the popular pressure was get the river to be as efficient as possible. In other words, let's get rid of the floods. In doing that, all you're doing is pushing floods to the town further downstream.
Currently, the biggest issue for the village is flooding. For every old person, there's going to be a minibus or sort of transport coming in to pick them up to take them to a centre. And if you need people able to help with that, the last time we were under threat was last year. We had the chief executive of Doncaster City Council, the deputy chief exec, about 50 or 60 villagers out there humping sandbags. We did a 400-metre section of the bank that needed doing on sandbags with the water lapping onto the bank.
We came up with a scheme to re-meander a section of the River Dern at Pastures Road. It worked unbelievably well. Prior to us completing that scheme, the Rivers Authority were having to dredge that channel every year. All of the energy had been taken out of the river by widening it. I mean, there's a simple equation. If you increase the cross-section of a river by half, you increase the settlement of solid by 4 times. So what was happening, it was just like a sink. Anyway, we finally managed to persuade our colleagues in flood defence to carry out some remedial work on the new channel. And we did that by creating a natural profile. That channel has never been dredged to this day. That was in 1994. That was the first re-meandering scheme carried out in this country, and it provided a blueprint for what you can do to renaturalise the river and to give it its life by creating different types of habitat, deep pools, shallows, gravel beds, all naturally reformed. And all of those are fundamental, really, to healthy fish stocks. Fish are there, you're going to get your herons and your kingfishers and so on, you know, as well as I do. And variety is the spice of life, literally. It certainly is in a river system. The recovery of otter populations in the river is a clear indication that things are pretty healthy.
Amazingly enough, just upstream of Adwick-on-Dearne, you have breeding colonies of avocets. I mean, just sort of 25 years ago, you would have been regarded as a nutcase if you'd suggested not only that avocets might seasonally occur, but suddenly turn up and actually breed, bringing back complexes of species which hadn't been seen for probably a couple of centuries. When I started at Doncaster Museum, one of the first displays I did was to display species like spoonbill, common crane, bittern, which had in fact not only lived in Doncaster, occurred in the Doncaster district, but had actually bred there in days gone by. So places like Tranmore and Tranmere, which were local sites, meant Cranemore. One of the names for bittern was Butterbumps. They were local road names which reflected that. Nowadays, all these species, including spoonbill, occur in the Doncaster district. So historically, it's happened very, very rapidly.
The number of birds on there, it's got to be seen to be believed at some times of the year. Nesting birds there, or nesting on the water, fantastic. Anybody who's not touched by that, then, sorry, I don't understand.
I like to go to, the way you went, I like to go there and walk along the side of the river and the canal. And there's no smell whatsoever, absolutely no smell. Beautiful. And of course, there's fish in it now. You can see kingfishers, things like that. No, I think we're in a far better place.
The economic situation the country's in, I was fearful of, in the urgency to transform things, planning authorities will not be as diligent in recognising the protection of the environment. I hope that's not the case. If you look at what's happened to the river over the centuries, it's all been down to money. When it comes to, the economy of the country, and let's face it, there are a lot of people really struggling in this country at the moment. The temptation to cut corners is going to be one that's going to be a bit of a battle for planning authorities. Let's hope it's not so big a battle that they lose it.
That's it for this episode. A big thank you to South Yorkshire Biodiversity Research Group for capturing people's memories, and thank you to the interviewees Chris Firth, Colin Howes, Peter Trimmingham, Ian Hurst, Rachel Walker, Chris Sherburn, Stuart Goddard, and Charles Day. And thank you to the National Lottery Heritage Fund